Government Motion 503. Dr. Starkey.
Honourable Member for Vermilion Lloydminster.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and it's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce debate on Motion 503. Be it resolved that the Legislative Assembly urge the government to amend its fiscal management policies and practices and introduce any necessary legislation to ensure that revenue from fees, levies, specific taxes and fines go directly to support the program and services requiring those fees, levies, specific taxes and fines to be collected and not deposited into the General Revenue Fund. So what does all that mean, Madam Speaker? Well, Madam Speaker, in motions other than government motions, we can have an open discussion about a number of different topics, and in this case the discussion is going to be about taxation. Now, there's always been a lot of discussion about taxation and about going back through history, and the arguments that continue to this day. So we have to ask ourselves questions like, why do governments levy taxes in the first place? And what about fees, levies, fines, and other sources of government revenue? What is their purpose? And should taxes and taxation policy be used as a lever to change human behavior, and is it indeed effective in doing so? So to focus today's discussion, I want to look at one of the fundamental challenges we face as legislators today, and that is people don't like taxes. Now, it's been said that the only popular tax is the one that someone else has to pay. But one of the reasons that people don't like taxes is that there is a disconnect between the payment of the tax and the benefit derived. We live in a transactional society where we regularly exchange funds for a specified good or service. We make many decisions about those transactions, choosing, for example, to purchase an item with a greater perceived value and being prepared to pay more for it. But taxes don't work that way. We pay taxes on a wide variety of ways, but the connection to what we receive in return as citizens in return for those levied funds is tenuous at best. This is especially true when the revenue from taxation is not earmarked for specific purposes, but rather it goes into general revenue. Now, there is a widespread belief that as elected officials, we are not faithful and trustworthy stewards of those funds. And anyone who has been placed in a position of public trust and trust over the public purse should exercise that duty as a sacred trust. In fact, 200 years ago, the 5th President of the United States, James Monroe, said to the joint houses of the U.S. Congress, quote, "To impose taxes when the public exigencies require them is an obligation of the most sacred character, especially with a free people," unquote. People just don't talk that way anymore. It's a shame. We have all heard the examples of wasteful expenditure, and it is completely understandable that taxpayers who have contributed to those general revenues are upset. We should all be. And it has prompted us to introduce various safeguards and accountability mechanisms in an attempt to eliminate these cases of imprudent spending. But even in these instances, taxpayers have reason to question the stewardship of those dollars. The recent investigation by the Federal Auditor General, Michael Ferguson, into Senate expenditures found some 30 instances of inappropriate expenditures totaling just under $1 million. Now, that's certainly serious and should not be minimized in any way, but the cost of the 2-year audit to find those expenditures was some $23.6 million. Canadian taxpayers shelled out $24 for every dollar of inappropriate expenditure that was uncovered. Now, the mechanisms that we put in place to monitor the spending of taxpayer dollars all come at a cost. And while there is a perception that these mechanisms will save the taxpayer by curtailing wasteful or inappropriate expenditure, they often end up costing more than they save. So what am I suggesting? Some of the taxes, levies, fees, and fines that the government collects are related specifically to a purpose, or at the very least, those that pay the taxes can be connected to a related expenditure. For example, the tourism levy, what some people call the pillow tax, is a 4% charge added to your hotel bill when you stay in a fixed roof accommodation anywhere in Alberta. Now, when it was first devised in 2005, the intent was that the levy would be used to fund the promotion of tourism in Alberta, and it did. For many years, every dollar collected by the tourism levy was reinvested into the promotion of Alberta as a tourist destination through Travel Alberta and the Tourism Ministry. Not a single penny of taxpayer dollars went to pay for tourism efforts in Alberta, and the ministry was indeed self-funding. And since about 50% of the tourism levy was collected from non-residents of Alberta, we had devised a way to have those visiting our province help to further promote it as a tourism destination. Now, this model was so successful that it became a template for nearly every Canadian province which now has a similar tourism levy in place. Sadly, the current government has chosen to siphon revenue from the tourism levy into general revenue. Now, some 30% of the revenue of the levy now flows into government coffers as general revenue, and despite its insistence that this government supports tourism as a key driver of economic diversification, this government has cut funding to tourism in each of its years in office. Now, my argument is simple. Take the full amount of the tourism levy and use it to fund the operations of the Tourism Ministry and Travel Alberta. And given that every dollar spent in this way used to return $19.50 to Alberta Treasury and various other forms of revenue, and we don't know what that number is now because they've stopped measuring it, that would seem to be a good investment. Well, let's look at another example. The Alberta government collects just under $1 billion annually in tobacco taxes. And we know that these tobacco-related costs to our healthcare systems numbers in the billions of dollars every year. And yet Alberta Health spends only $4 million each year on tobacco reduction initiatives. That's less than half of 1% of tobacco tax revenue. If we were to specifically earmark, say, 2% of tobacco tax revenue to a robust tobacco reduction strategy, which we actually already have in place if this government would ever get around to proclaiming and acting on it, just think of the kinds of savings in both reduced human suffering and lower healthcare costs that we could glean. Sometimes it's a matter of more closely tying revenues that already exist to existing expenditures. For example, the government collects $1.4 billion each year in provincial fuel excise taxes. Now, according to Budget 2018 numbers, the Ministry of Transportation is investing some $1.2 billion in capital projects this year. So if those two numbers were more closely tied together, and it was clearly explained that the excise taxes are going to fund capital expenditures on roadways and bridges, I would suggest that the acceptance level would at least rise to a level of begrudging. But as it is currently, I hear the complaints every day. Madam Speaker, there are many other examples, from camping fees in our provincial parks, which are far too low, to fees charged for basic services from our registry offices, where our government takes in revenue, but there is little or no connection to the cost of the service provided. And every time we charge a fee for a service that does not cover the full cost of providing that service is receiving a subsidy from the taxpayer. Unless we can establish that providing that subsidy is in the greater public good and is therefore worthy of support from general revenue, we should seriously consider changing the fee structure to move more toward a cost recovery model for providing that service. Now, what this motion suggests is that we establish a more direct link between the fees, charges, levies, and taxes that Albertans pay to the services that we require. And Albertans do care about this issue. Just look at the reaction to the government's recent announcement that, contrary to what had been promised before, the additional $20 per ton in carbon tax that will be levied starting in 2021 and again in 2022 will now go into general revenue. Whatever happened to the promise that every dollar collected would go either into rebates, tax reductions, or initiatives to combat climate change? Your attempts to call the last $20 of the carbon tax as the federal carbon tax, while the first $30 was the provincial carbon tax, well, Minister, nobody's believing you. There will always be a need for funds to flow into general revenue, and the government has many sources of revenue that would qualify. We have $11 billion in personal income tax, $4 billion in corporate income tax, roughly $3 billion in investment income, and $4 billion from non-renewable resource revenue. Interestingly, that totals $22 billion, roughly the same as the Health Department's 2018 budget. So the next time you're having a coffee shop discussion with folks about provincial spending, you could point out that the Health Department, roughly 40% of our government's budgeted expenditures, would take every penny in income taxes, both corporate and personal, resource royalty revenues, plus investment income. And the question then becomes, what do we use to pay for the other 60%? And the total list of revenue sources can be found in our budgetary documents. Madam Speaker, if taxes are indeed a certainty, and as Benjamin Franklin said, the only two certain things in life are death and taxes, and if we are to be good and faithful stewards of not just tax dollars, but of all of the funds entrusted to us by Albertans, I think it behooves us to make the best possible use of those funds, to minimize wasteful or unnecessary spending, but also to demonstrate clearly to the people of Alberta, where possible, the connections between revenue and expenditure. And I look forward to the debate.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.